In this video, we'll take a look at a concept that is known as the terms of trade. Now, this is a bit of jargon, but it's actually an easy concept. When economists talk about the terms of trade, what they're really talking about is the world relative price of a country's imported good or exported good. That is, the rate at which it can trade its own export good for imports of the other good. So let's start with a simple example. Imagine that the price of oil in the world market is $50 a barrel, and the price of wheat is $5 a bushel, and that a country starts out with 100 bushels of wheat on hand. And that is the product that this country is going to export on the international market in exchange for oil. So once again, the country starts with 100 bushels of wheat on hand, can take this and trade it internationally with foreign customers that are willing to pay a price. And if that price turns out to be the $5 a bushel, then the country can turn around, sell this exported good wheat internationally, and with that, it will be able to get $500 for the sale of its products on the international market. So now the country has the $500 of export earnings, which it can then turn around and go to the international market and buy its imported good. In other words, at the current prices, it can buy 10 barrels of oil with its export revenue. That's another way of saying that the terms of trade for this country is that it can turn 100 bushels of wheat into 10 barrels of oil using the international market. That's its terms of trade. Another way to express this is that 10 bushels of wheat are equal to the equivalent of 1 barrel of oil. Now, sometimes this terms of trade is expressed in a slightly different way, but it's the same idea. That is to say, the relative price of oil on the international markets. But it's just the same as terms of trade. So let's look at this first from the standpoint of oil. That is, the price of oil in terms of wheat on the international market. Now, we write this as the price of oil divided by the price of wheat. That is, the price of one product compared to the other. Now, these ratios can be a little bit confusing unless you break them down into parts. That is to say, look at the price of oil and divide it literally by the price of wheat. Again, in this particular example, we've got $50 per barrel of oil, and then we divide that by $10 per bushel of wheat, and look at the ratios of these two. And you'll notice that the dollars cancel in this ratio, and what we're left with is 10 bushels per barrel. That is to say that it would take sales of 10 bushels of wheat in order to earn enough to buy 1 barrel of oil. That's the terms of trade for a country that is exporting wheat in order to buy oil on the international market. Now, you could just as easily look at this from the standpoint of wheat, that is to say, the relative price of wheat. And that's quite simple. You just look at the reciprocal of the relative price of oil, and we're going to see that it really is the same information, just expressed in a slightly different way. Once again, we want to take a look at the price of wheat in terms of oil, and in this instance, you're going to express this as the ratio of the price of wheat divided by the price of oil. So we take $10 per bushel divided by $50 per barrel to look at the relative price of wheat on international markets. And this can be simplified relatively easily once again. So this time we see that this can be simplified to 1/10 of a barrel of oil per bushel of wheat on the international markets. which in the end is exactly the same relationship as we had seen before. On international markets, 10 bushels of wheat are the equivalent of 1 barrel of oil. So let's take a look at this graphically. We've got oil on the y-axis and wheat on the x-axis. And once again, we're imagining a country that starts out with 100 bushels of wheat. And for simplicity, let's assume that it starts out with no oil at all. So on the graph, we have the blue point circled by the red circle, which reflects how much the country starts with. The country can turn this into oil at the rate that is going in the international market. If it sells off every bit of its wheat, all 100 bushels of wheat, at the international prices, it can turn that into 10 barrels of oil, which is exactly another way of expressing graphically what we had done before algebraically. But of course, it's quite possible that the country wouldn't want to sell off all 100 units of wheat. So let's suppose instead that it sells 40 units of wheat. That will mean that it retains 60, but then transforms these 40 units of wheat into oil on the international market at the relevant international prices. In other words, it turns its 40 bushels of wheat into 4 barrels of oil at the international prices that we've assumed here. This new combination means that the country now has 60 units of wheat and 4 barrels of oil if it only sells off some of its supply of wheat at international prices. Of course, there are other possibilities. It could sell 80 units of wheat, retaining 20, and get 8 barrels of oil on the international market. That's one of the possibilities. And ultimately, how much it sells depends on both what the country wants to consume, what consumers in that country want to consume, and how much the foreign trade, the country with which you're trading wants to buy your good. So now we're really looking at the options. It could also sell only 20 units of wheat on the international market, retaining 80. And this would allow the country to buy 2 units of oil on the international market. And if you look at all the different possible combinations of wheat that it could sell and oil that it could buy, you'll get this straight line. It's the value of national income line, which we've discussed before. That is the value of 100 bushels of wheat production at the international prices, i.e. at the original terms of trade. Again, in this particular example, the terms of trade measured with oil on the y-axis and wheat on the x-axis is 1/10 of a barrel of oil per bushel of wheat. That's simply the slope of this national income line. Now, there's nothing special about putting oil on the y-axis and wheat on the x-axis. You could just as easily do them in reverse, but you need to be sure to change the slope of the international prices. So we'll take a look at this from the standpoint of the other good. So you put wheat on the y-axis and oil on the x-axis, and once again, the y-intercept is going to be the amount of wheat that the country has on hand, and the 10 represents the amount of oil it could purchase if it sells off all 100 units of wheat. This is exactly the same information as we had before, just looking at it from the other good standpoint. In this case, the slope of the terms of trade is going to be 10 bushels of wheat per barrel of oil. But keep in mind, this is exactly the same as the other depiction, just with the axes reversed and the slope of the line and the relative prices and terms of trade adjusted appropriately. Now let's imagine what would happen if the price of wheat rises for this country. Again, this is the exported good, so you already imagine that it's going to be good for this country to have the price of its exported good go up. And we're going to see that in this national income line and the terms of trade depicted in these graphs. This is what's called a terms of trade improvement for the country, if the price of its export good goes up. So let's imagine now that the price of wheat internationally is $10 per bushel. It had been $5 per bushel, so now we've got a doubling in the price of this good on international market. Once again, this is going to be deemed a terms of trade improvement for the wheat exporter. Now on your own, think about what would happen if the price of oil decreased instead of the price of wheat going up. That also is a terms of trade improvement. It means that for a physical quantity of wheat, you'll be able to get more of the imported good. Both of those would be considered a terms of trade improvement for the wheat exporter. So if you start out with the same 100 bushels of wheat at the new set of prices, we're going to get a new terms of trade, a new slope of this national income line associated with production of 100 bushels of wheat, and it's going to be steeper in this graph. That is to say, you're going to be able to take the same physical quantity of wheat. This will now be turned in $1,000 at the international prices with the 100 bushels of wheat, and it will be able to buy more oil with the same amount of exports. So now the country can buy 20 barrels of oil if the price of oil had remained at $50 per barrel. That is going to be a physical representation of the improvement that the country experiences by an increase in the price of its good on international market. And this is very easy to depict graphically. This red line is the terms of, or the national income at the new terms of trade, 100 bushels of wheat, which can now be turned into 20 barrels of oil, or any combination in between. The country doesn't have to sell all 100 units. It can sell some, but every unit of wheat will be worth more in the international market because of the price change. So what is the particular relative price now that the price of wheat has changed? We look at the price of wheat compared to the price of oil, that is to say the relative price of wheat, $10 per bushel over $50 per barrel, and we get a new ratio where the slope of this line is 1/5 of a barrel of oil per bushel of wheat. It takes less wheat to get a barrel of oil after the price change compared to what it was before the terms of trade improvement. So, a terms of trade improvement for a country means that there's an increase in the price of its exports relative to the price of imports. That can be because the price of exports went up or the price of imports went down. You get the same direction of change. This results in an expansion of the national income, the value of the production of the country in terms of international prices, and an expansion of the consumption possibilities of the country.